Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The session will commence in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The session is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Philippa Stroud.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all slept well. We're deeply conscious there are some very jet-lagged people out there, but we're delighted to see the room full again this morning and ready to rebuild the foundations of Western civilization. Yesterday was all about the best of our inheritance. And I know many of you were trying to get hold of this book yesterday, and there were problems with the card reader. It is all sorted, so feel free to part with your money today for the best of our inheritance. But today is Choices Day. Today is all about the choices that we face. Whether or not we will continue down a nihilistic pathway, whether or not we'll find a new source of inspiration for our civilization, or whether we will reconnect with the original inspiration of our civilization. To help us on that journey, we commissioned 7 choices papers that you should find in a bag on or near your seat. These are to help equip our thinking as we move forward together. But also to unpack these ideas and themes for us today, we are going to be helped on that journey by Douglas Murray, by Jordan Peterson interviewing Nigel Farage, and then by Ayaan Hirsi Ali telling her own story about the different values of different civilizations around the world. We are in for a real treat this morning. But before we kick off, we just want to look at a short video. Now, this video was actually made for us by Truth Rising. You will have seen their exhibition stand next door. They have been around the world looking at different civilizations. They have been working with numbers of the advisory board of ARC, and we're delighted that they gifted us this video to sum up the choices that we have as we face this moment in our history. Ladies and gentlemen.
The Parthenon, the Colosseum, the Great Pyramid of Giza, Angkor Wat. All the great civilizations in the past can only be found in 3 places. They're in ruins, they're in museums, or they're in history books. Great though they were, they rose and they declined and they fell. In other words, there was what historians call a civilizational moment. Something inspired them and made them the greatness that they were. But at a certain moment in the course of their history, they lost touch with the inspiration and the dynamism that made them what they were. And when that moment came, there are only 3 broad options: renewal of the inspiration, replacement of the inspiration, or decline.
I do think our civilization is at such a tipping point. And I think our options are very limited, but I think we can already see that the alternative fuels that we've tried to put into the great engines of democracy have failed. The great engines really were the Judeo-Christian concepts of accountability to a higher authority, and its resultant sort of individual responsibility coupled with doing the right thing by your neighbour, loving your neighbour. They've been massively diminished. Radical individualism, the new fuel that we've tried to put into the machine, has it coughing and spluttering and looking like it's going to die.
I think we need to decide what exactly our civilization is. Is it just an entertainment? Are we just an audience for a succession of fleeting sensations, sitting on our couches, constantly doom scrolling and changing the channel. If that's what we think civilization is, then I think we'll share the fate of the Romans. We don't communicate the great truths of civilization via emojis.
The West has repudiated the inspiration and the dynamic by which it arose. And many of its greatest ideas, such as human dignity, come from the Bible, the book that made the West. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment, Voltaire, Rousseau, Goethe, Kant, they thought the Enlightenment, which they described in one word as reason, would replace the Christian faith. But 3 centuries later, you can see that while the intellectuals have rejected the Christian faith, the Enlightenment as a replacement has clearly failed. And so there's no question that across the West today, you see people talking about Western decline.
If you sever the civilization from its source, and in our case, the Judeo-Christian foundations, you will no longer see a civilization that is thriving and flourishing. For me, the most extraordinary building block and foundation stone of the West is the extraordinary dignity of every single human being. I mean, that's a profoundly radical thought, that every single human being is of infinite worth. It was the turning point and the foundational building block of everything that we know today. But then laid over that were the principles of freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom to own property. These were the foundational freedoms alongside rule of law, democracy, and we kind of have taken these things for granted.
I do think our civilization is at a tipping point. So the choices are quite binary, quite frankly. We decline like other civilizations, or we need to go and rediscover what our ancestors believed in so deeply when they fought and died and shed so much in the way of sweat and tears to give us what we actually do enjoy today.
So the West is at this civilizational moment and faced with this choice: renewal or replacement or decline.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Douglas Murray.
Thank you and good morning. So good to see all of you here, and thank you to the organisers of ARC for inviting me. Perhaps I could just start by saying that I think that the challenge that Philippa and the organisers of this conference have laid out is much bigger even than we speakers have been told. It's a sort of challenge upon a challenge to be invited to be optimistic about the future from the wastelands of East London. And I'd like to tell all foreign visitors to this conference that if you go just a few miles from this conference centre, you'll find a most charming and historical city with many landmarks worth seeing. One of the questions, I think, that all ages ask themselves is, what do they call the age that they are in? Almost every age has had this question. Most recently, the age of modernism asked what comes after modernism, and the rather unoriginal idea was postmodernism. Postmodernism, of course, included its offspring of deconstructionism, and nothing came from that. But I would like to suggest a name for the age that we should be in, and the age that this conference can help bring in: the age of reconstruction. We should be the reconstructionists. The deconstructionists knew something about how to take things apart, but like children with bicycles, had no idea how to put them back together. So it'll be the job of people like those in this room to try to put that civilization back together, and I'm delighted that that's one of the things that we're gathered here to do. I wanted to lay out two broad ideas of what we can do to bring that to pass. First, let me just give an example. Since we are in Britain and there are many Europeans here, I might just make reference to the fact there seems already to be, not in this room, but in Europe, widely a certain contempt for innovations that are occurring in the US, not least at governmental level. There's a whining and a howling about, for instance, Doge's attempts to not just stop government waste, but actually to reform by exposing government waste. One of the great advantages of Doge so far is you don't only see a way in which a country like America might balance the budget, but in stripping away all of those layers of bureaucracy and budget, you also unveil underneath it the kind of rot that our societies have been willing to put up with along the way. I gather that the administration in DC is looking to do, after USAID, something which was found to be so rotten that it had to be gotten rid of in its entirety, is looking at doing the Department of Education. In America, as in the rest of the West, there is no greater task to do. In New York State, where I spend much of my time, an average spend at a state school is now per pupil around $35,000 a year. For that sum, K through 12 students finish with only just about half of them with basic literacy and half with basic numeracy. So nobody can tell us that money is the problem. Money is not the problem. You could keep throwing money at this problem and you can still create more and more illiterates. So I just wanted to mention briefly the two things I think that can be looked at. The first is, of course, innovation. Again, for those of us in Europe and in Britain, there's an enormous amount to learn, rather than to scorn the American experience. There are reasons why so many of the unicorn startups are from America, why disproportionately they're still from America. There must be something that they're doing right. In this country, we still have a situation where 1 in 5 of the working age population simply do not work, and we, the rest of the taxpayers, subsidize those people not to work. And this seems to me to be a great national scandal, but still something which our governments don't care to address. To my mind, one of the great explanations for this disparity in innovation between Europe and America is a very simple question. It's our attitude towards risk. The idea in America remains that life is indeed risky, that success is risky. And in much of the rest of the West, we've fallen into a kind of complacency, which is a sort of welfarism. When I returned to the UK recently, I discovered that the great debate in the UK was about how to kill the elderly more efficiently. And I was struck that the only argument that any Labour minister could make against euthanasia coming online with the NHS was that she didn't think that the NHS was capable of performing euthanasia efficiently. I mentioned in The Spectator at the time that this was, I think, wrong in one important degree. The NHS is a world leader in killing the elderly. It's just that they only kill the people who don't want to die. The NHS, to which endless governments in this country pour money, is always told to us to be the envy of the world, and yet, of course, none of us can find a GP appointment. But I wanted to mention one other main thing, and to do so I just want to reflect on something that's been much on my mind in the last couple of years. I spent most of the last couple of years in Ukraine and much lengthier time in the Middle East covering the wars there. And when I returned to the UK in December, I bumped into a politician friend from Westminster, and I was extolling the virtues of the IDF, with whom I've been embedded for much of the last year in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere. And she said to me, isn't it remarkable that extraordinary events throw up these extraordinary people? I was singing the praises of the amazing young men and women of the IDF as they battle the death cults of Hamas and Hezbollah. And this politician said to me, it is amazing, isn't it, Douglas, that this young generation has stepped up to the challenge, has answered that question of whether or not their generation is fit for the civilizational challenge. And she said, it's extraordinary the way in which events throw up people. And I said to her, there's a tweak we need to do to that analysis, which is it's not just extraordinary events that throw up extraordinary people. It's extraordinary events when they come up against people who have been extraordinarily well cultured. And what I mean by that is that it's not enough that a civilization or a generation comes across a defining moment. It is that when that happens, you know what you're fighting for. It is that you know you're fighting for your faith, for your family, for your people, for your tradition, for your way of life, and very much more. Clever people can sometimes say very stupid things. And in a recent interview, Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, was asked if there was any book that he would recommend that people could read in the present to understand the future that's coming. And he said no, he couldn't think of such a book because change was going to be so incredibly fast. And I said a couple of days later at an event in Jerusalem, that's flat out wrong. Change has always happened. And if you want a book to guide you, how about having the book that guided your forebears? Now, to do that, you have to come to the second thing I wanted to mention this morning that you need for civilizational renewal, and that's the ability to look back. To look back. We've wasted so much time in recent years. We've wasted so much time. People have made us move at such a retarded speed. We've had years of talking about the most basic things that our species knew, men and women, what are they? Come on. Who had time for this? Who has... And the problem is that there is a cost to this. There has been a civilizational cost to be made to go at the speed of the slowest kids in the class. Now, one response to the era of mass migration that I've written a great amount has been what I've described as the deculturation of our societies. The idea that in order to welcome people into our societies, we effectively have to pretend that we are uninteresting places, unimportant places until migration makes us interesting. And I just wanted to mention an analogy here which my friend Eric Weinstein, who's come in today from LA, gave me this idea a while ago. He said as a boy he had the impression that ice cream was something whose base flavor was vanilla and all other flavors were added on top of vanilla. And he said it was only at some point in his youth that he discovered that vanilla itself is a flavor, and a very complex flavor. Now, we in the West have created an extraordinarily complex and rich flavor, and we have spent recent years pretending that we have no flavor, or that flavor is something that only other people bring to us. And this is, of course, flat out wrong, but it's been something that we have told more than one generation of young people in the West. We've told them that we don't really have anything very great, or if we do, we oughtn't to talk about it too much. And I believe that that is flat out wrong, because what we have in cities like that just a little way up the road, and in the cities of Europe and the West, are the greatest civilization that the world has known. And we have the choice. We have the choice either to live in the wastelands or to rebuild them. Now, there are cities in Europe, I think of cities like Budapest, I think of many German cities, where the idea is that you actually can restore beauty to the built environment, that people do not need to wander like lost souls around the wastelands of East London looking for meaning against buildings that tell them you are nothing, you do not matter. We have the opportunity to restore, not just in the built environment, but in the educational environment, to make sure that when we talk about our culture, we don't just talk about it, but we also do it. For people to realize that our culture is not just something they revere, but something that young people can add to understand the conversation, the poetry of mankind, to understand that just because Mozart is great does not mean you cannot build on Mozart, that just because the great buildings are great does not mean you cannot add to them. I would urge, in the age of reconstruction, that our great task is not just to break through with innovation, but to reclaim what is ours, to say that we love it, and that if people wish to join us in the veneration of this civilization, they are very, very willing to do so. If they don't wish to join us, there are other places they can be. Everybody knows that those of us who revere T.S. Eliot revere him in part because he told us, and indeed tells us still, that a civilization can be reclaimed even at the 11th hour. But even in this hall, I would say that there is another possibility as well, which other philosophers, Strauss and others, also give us, which is the possibility that civilization can also be reclaimed even at the 13th hour, even in the most inauspicious circumstances, and most importantly today, from the most inauspicious of locations. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jordan Peterson and Nigel Farage.
Very good. Excellent.
So we might as well get right to it, I guess. I'm curious about the overlap, or the lack of overlap, I suppose, in the principles that we've been promoting. I've been thinking, for example, some of the success of the convention so far and of our organization has been, well, the positive vision element of what we're promoting. And I guess that's where I'd like to go with you. Yesterday we had a very interesting panel on energy, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, energy and the environment. Scott Tinker in particular has outlined a vision of the future, and it's not a net zero vision, I can tell you that. It's a vision where we cooperate to do everything we possibly can to drive energy prices down as low as they can possibly be, using everything at our disposal, right? Nuclear, coal, gas, oil, solar, wind, whatever can compete, because the most effective way of enriching the absolutely poor and likely of serving long-term environmental needs is to make people wealthy, so they can afford to care about the future, especially in the developing world. And so I'm kind of wondering, you have an opportunity now, because the right is split in the UK, to really hash things out on the conservative side. And this sort of thing happened a bit in Canada, and that means that it's possible now for conservatives to push the envelope. And I'm really curious about your view on it isn't exactly even on net zero, which I think is an appalling policy, to get that right out on the table. But more than that, it's like, how appalling is it?
Good morning, everybody.
Yeah.
Old-fashioned upbringing, couldn't help it. First things first, the right is not split in this country. The Conservative Party is not on the right in any measurable way. 14 years that brought us the highest tax burden since 1947. 14 years that saw mass immigration, legal mass immigration on a scale hitherto never even dreamt of. 14 years that saw illegal immigration, small boats crossing the channel, and the government completely incapable of dealing with it because they couldn't face up to what membership of the European Convention on Human Rights was all about. And 14 years that saw net zero enshrined into law by a Conservative government and Boris Johnson, Theresa May, as evangelical about net zero as the current Ed Miliband. We take the view that if we're going to be using gas, if we're going to be using oil in this country till 2050, and even the most zealous net zero types accept we'll be using these commodities for years to come, our view is if we're going to be using them, we may as well produce them ourselves in our own country and genuinely become energy independent. And our platform is to re-industrialise Britain. We've closed down our steel industry. You know, we think closing down a steel industry is good because it means our national CO2 output is down. And all that happens is the plant closes in Redcar, the plant closes in South Wales, it reopens in India under lower environmental standards, and then the steel is shipped back to us. So let's produce all the stuff we need in this country. Let's become not just energy independent, we could actually become an energy exporter. Right now, every day we import 10 to 15% of our electricity, and our industrial energy prices are between 4 and 6 times higher than America. Not only that, but everybody out there, and of course this hurts the poor more than anybody, we've had 20% subsidies on domestic electricity bills going on now for the best part of 2 decades. And it's a truth that no one dares tell. So look, net zero is a complete and utter disaster. If you want to have energy production that is very, very low in carbon output, there is only one way ahead. That is small, modular, nuclear reactors, dozens of them all over the country. It's the only way forward.
Okay. Well,
it's the only way forward. And you know, if you look at the way the Far East produces nuclear energy, we can do it a damn sight cheaper than we've ever done it before.
Okay. Well, that warms a Canadian's heart. It's good to get warm in a convention centre that's this chilly because of the net zero restrictions. But let me push it a little bit, you know, because we have the opportunity to do that, and I think that it's time. You know, you talked about at least until 2050, and one of the things I've been discussing with my fellow Canadians, let's say, is the fact that, I mean, maybe it's time to stop our obsession with carbon altogether, and so I'm going to say something relatively radical, and let's just play this out and see how it goes. So, you know, I've reviewed a lot of scientific papers. Now, they're not climate papers, but I'm a reasonable hand at separating the wheat from the chaff on the scientific front. And when I look at the carbon data, there is one fact that leaps out to me in my experience with scientific data is that there's usually 1 or 2 major facts and a bunch of trivial sub-facts that more or less you can ignore. As far as I can tell, the most stunning effect of carbon, atmospheric carbon, that has been recorded scientifically is the effect of carbon on plant growth. Right. And we know this. Look, in the last 25 years, thereabouts, 20% of the Earth's surface is greened. 20% is a lot. It's a lot. It's an area equivalent to twice the size of the continental U.S., so that gives you a quick picture of scale. And it's also primarily greened in semi-arid areas, because when you give plants more carbon dioxide, they're stomaticlose, and so they can live where it's drier. And so the deserts are shrinking, not growing, which is exactly the opposite of what we were told was going to happen. And crop yields are up, something approximating 10 to 13%. So that's not bad. That's good. And so I'm afraid that even throwing the dog a bone, let's say, and saying, well, we're certainly not going to hit our 2030 targets because they were proposed by buffoons and liars, we're not going to hit our 2050 targets either. I'm dead serious. This is not good. And so I'm curious about how far this needs to be taken. I have because I also think, conceivably, that the environmentalist climate scam was really an offshoot of the Club of Rome Malthusian stupidity that is predicated on the presumption that resources are finite and that there's far too many people on the planet, and there's a terrible anti-human motivation lurking underneath all of that that's pessimistic and brutal and genocidal in its fundamental ethos. And I think it's kind of time for people who would like energy to be inexpensive and reliable and there for the poor to just end it. It's like no more carbon apocalypse mongering and terrorizing. And so I guess I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, the one thing that drives me absolutely potty is when I hear that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Mm-hmm. That's what they tell us. That clearly is absolutely nuts. Now, there are times in our past when CO2 in the atmosphere has been much, much higher than it is today, and that's before people drove 4x4 Chelsea tractors. And I remember having this debate about 20 years ago. There was a man called Sir Patrick Moore.
Yes.
Very famous scientist, The Sky at Night, great character, very respected man. And I said to him about 20 years ago, I said, Patrick, what do you think about man's impact on the environment through CO2? He said, well, it's impossible to think man doesn't have some sort of impact. He said, but when it comes to carbon dioxide levels and when it comes to warming and cooling, he said, let me assure you that sunspot activity and underwater volcanic activity will always have a bigger impact on the environment than man himself ever can, and I very much stuck to that view. So I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you whether CO2 is leading to warming or not, but there are so many other massive factors. And Jordan, I was told that of all the CO2 that's produced every year in the world, only 3 to 5% of it is produced by mankind. So we do, as you rightly say, need to get this debate into a sense of perspective. And I sometimes think that the carbon dioxide hysteria has actually blinded us to other environmental disasters that are going on, such as the rape of our oceans and many other things. I'm an environmentalist in the old school sense and definition of that term. A bit more common sense, that's what we need.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to harass you about one other issue too. I think we'll focus on 2 out of our 5 platforms. So the principle that we've founded ourselves on that actually produced the most internal dissent in our organization was our family policy. Now, I spent a fair bit of time speaking with authorities in Hungary about their family policy. Hungary spends a substantial amount of their GDP on family policy. It's 7%. They were concerned about a variety of issues. High rate of abortion, high rate of divorce, low rate of female participation in the workforce. That's just kind of a strange addition to that group, but that was still a concern. And extremely low birth rate. And so they made it a priority to address those, and they've had some success reducing abortion, which is still legal in Hungary, substantively, reducing the divorce rate, flattening the decline in the birth rate. They haven't managed to pop it up again. Only Israel has managed that, by the way, and it's not exactly obvious why. And we argued this out amongst the ARC members, and our consensus by the end was that the core of civilization, as such, and the Western civilization that we're attempting to reinvigorate, let's say, is, first of all, a circle of tolerance, okay? So we'll make that the a priori axiom, but then a commitment to long-term, stable, married, monogamous, heterosexual, child-centered marriages. And so now that's a fairly restrictive ideal. You know, ideals are restrictive. And, you know, we're all cognizant of the fact that within our own families, for example, 40% of our siblings, let's say, are likely to be divorced, that there's no shortage of single mothers, that homosexuality and homosexual couples exist, and that there's going to be deviations from the norm. But I'm curious, again, like in your view, you could make the case that that stable, committed monogamy, heterosexual, child-centered monogamy, is the kind of long-term commitment to community, to sacrifice, and to future that's the fundamental unit of civilized society. And so I'm curious, Mike, what do you think about that?
Well, I may not necessarily be the best advocate for monogamous heterosexuality or stable marriage, having been divorced twice. But do I think family matters? Jordan, on the 3rd of June last year, as I was coming into London by car to go back into politics, having left it a few years before, my ambition was to get the United Kingdom to be a self-governing, independent nation. And for many, many years, I was pretty much on my own fighting that battle. The day we left the European Union, I thought, right, I've done my job. And that day on the 3rd of June, when I was coming back, thinking, well, this really rather comfortable, lovely life I've got is about to disappear, I thought, why am I doing it? And I came up with 3 words: family, community, and country. They're the things that matter to me above absolutely everything. And I have tried, in difficult circumstances, I've tried to make sure with both ex-wives that our children have had as stable an upbringing, given the circumstances, as they can possibly have. I think part of this, and this is important, about who we are as a country and who the West is, we've kind of forgotten that what underpins everything is our Judeo-Christian culture. And that's where we need to start. That's where we need to start. And if we recognise that, and if we value that, then I think everything comes from that. So yes, of course family matters enormously. Of course we need higher birth rates. But we're not going to get higher birth rates in this country until we can get some sense of optimism. And we need a complete 180 shift in attitudes. We've got to start telling young kids that hard work is good, that success is good, that there are no shortcuts in life, that making money is good. And what I see is we sort of disincentivize young people, and to think that another 1 million young people since the start of the pandemic are on disability benefits because they're suffering from depression and the doctors sign them off. We need some very, very big cultural changes. We've got to get that spirit, that sense of optimism back in the country. We had it in the late 1980s. We actually had it through much of the 1990s. That's what we have to recapture. And frankly, being led, as we are, God, doesn't Rachel Reeves just make you want to reach for the cry tissues? It's all so miserable. It's all so declinist. Frankly, the Conservatives have been no better. We need a change of attitude in Britain. And if we get that right, people will have more kids.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was short and sweet, and there's obviously many other issues that we could discuss, and no doubt will, but I would like to thank you very much for coming and talking to us today, and to letting me harass you about these issues. It's very good to talk to you, sir.
Thank you, George.
Yeah, good luck. Thank you, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to be back with you, those of you who were here last year, 1,500 strong, and welcome to those of you who are attending this conference for the first time. This year, it's 4,150. Congratulations to Philippa and to Jordan and to everyone else who made this happen. I want to begin with a simple point. This event has been organized by an Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. But citizenship implies a distinct political entity. For most of the modern era, that entity was called the nation-state. Modern liberals trashed the nation-state and nationalism, invoking Hitler and Mussolini, and arguing that nationalism